kinds of social programs to pull their countries out of deep depressions. Just a big difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. But I wanted to make that point. The other point I think you need to know is that if you made the decision to resist the Nazis, you weren't just taking your life in your hands, but the lives of your spouse, your children, your parents, your friends, your associates. I'm going to tell you about a plot to assassinate Hitler that involved 132 top military men. They, of course, were all executed. But based on that failed attempt, the Nazis murdered almost 2,000 German civilians as well. So it took a lot of courage to make the decision to resist the Nazis. And this organization right here, the Gestapo, they were very good at suppressing a lot of potential resistance. And the way that they did that was, as soon as the Nazis were in control here, their natural enemies were the communists, the social democrats, and people in the trade unions. So as soon as they were in control, the Gestapo arrested some leaders out of each of these organizations. They brought them here. They held them here for 5-6 weeks, badly abused them, verbally, psychologically, physically, and then they let them go. And what do you think they told their compatriots? This is one place you don't want to be brought to. People got to know that if you were brought to number 9, Prince Albrechtstrasse, the chances were you were going to leave it to either go to a concentration camp or to a morgue.
So that suppressed people even further.
Yeah. So right off the bat, it suppressed a lot of potential resistance. And yet, there was a resistance movement. There's a museum here in Berlin dedicated to the German resistance movement. There were literally thousands of people who found ways to resist the Nazis. I've picked 3 that I'm going to talk about. So I'll show you first a bad photograph of a good guy.
Better than a good photograph of a bad guy.
Here's a good photograph of a bad, bad guy. But here, this is Georg Elser.
Yeah.
You know about Georg? He lived in Munich. He was a simple guy. He was an electrician, but he hated the Nazis, and in particular, he hated Adolf Hitler. And he found out in 1939 that Hitler was coming to Munich to give a speech at a beer hall. So he built. This was before important people had good security. He built a bomb and he planted it under the podium where Hitler was going to speak that night. And he set it to go off toward the end of his speech. So this was 1939. Imagine if this would have worked.
Yeah.
Oh.
History would have taken a completely different turn. Unfortunately for history, Hitler was running late that day. He got to the beer hall late. He cut his speech short, and he left the building 11 minutes before the bomb went off. Georg was down at the Swiss border trying to get out of the country. The Gestapo arrested him, brought him back here, and you would certainly have assumed that the Nazis would have murdered a man like Elser, somebody who tried to assassinate the Fuhrer. But they didn't want to believe that one man would have been capable of this kind of a plot alone. So they had plans for Elser, and their plan was they were going to keep him alive until the end of the war, and then they assumed, of course, they were going to win. They were going to have a trial in which they were going to tie Elser together with the British MI6, the British intelligence, and expose this as a British plot to assassinate Hitler. So they moved this poor guy around from one concentration camp to another all through the war, and then 4 days before the end of the war, realizing that they weren't going to win anyway, they murdered Elser.
Well,
Terrible, huh?
Here in Berlin, there was a civilian resistance movement centered around 2 young couples. These are the Schultz Boysens.
Yeah.
You know, and these are their friends, the Harnacks. These were leftists. They weren't communists, but they were leftists. They used to meet in their living rooms and discuss politics. And they had a group of about 100 friends around them and associates that shared their political views. Once the Nazis were in control here, they had to meet secretly. They had a secret illegal printing press, and they were always looking for ways to resist this new regime. And this guy, Haro Schultz-Boysen, he found a very interesting way to resist the Nazis. He got drafted into the German army in 1939, and he finagled himself a job in Göring's air ministry. And he began stealing classified documents out of there and sending them off to Russia, to Moscow. He was a leftist anyway, so that was his tendency. And he actually stole a document out of that building that landed on Joseph Stalin's desk that clearly showed that the German army was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, and Stalin did not believe its authenticity. He ignored it. So another one of those times when history might have taken another turn, and it didn't.
Well, you can imagine how difficult it is to trust information in times like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy for us to say now, 60 years later. But when you're writing the
I've seen that document. It had the stamp, you know, the
could
Nazi
be misinformation.
stamp.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
You know, I came to think of when you said that, well, he just tore up the Versailles
Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah, what about the rest of the world? Didn't they react to that?
They were so tired of war. The First World War was a horror. You know, millions of young men were slaughtered in that war, and it hadn't been that long, and people remembered it, and there was no real willingness to go back to war, and the only way to stop Hitler would have been to start a war against him, and people just were not willing to do that. That's why I'm going to talk about that later on. Lord Chamberlain, you know, went down to Munich and signed this piece of paper that was going to bring peace in our time. Well, it didn't, but that's where the tendency was at that point, was to do anything possible to placate him, to calm him down, but sure.
he has a bigger nose though, but
So von Stauffenberg was a very interesting man. He was a military man before the Nazis came to power. And like any good military man, you get a new government, you serve your government. He initially had no problem with the Nazis. He went off to Africa in Rommel's Africa Corps, and in Africa he was badly wounded. He lost all the fingers on one hand and 3 on the other and 1 eye, and he was sent back to Berlin to recuperate. Yeah. And after his recuperation, he was reassigned to Poland. And when he got to Poland, he got to be an eyewitness to some of the atrocities that the SS was committing there, and it turned him into a real anti-Nazi. And he came to believe if you could cut the head off of the snake would die. He set out to assassinate Hitler. What's, I think, amazing about his story is, over the next year and a half or so, he had 3 or 4 different schemes worked out, involving a lot of people in a country that was so heavily and tightly controlled by a spy network. The fact that he was never exposed, I think, is amazing, but he wasn't. By 1944, he had risen to a point, a rank in the German army, where he got invited to a war conference at Hitler's Wolf's Lair. That was his army headquarters from where he directed his troops against the Soviet Union. So von Stauffenberg shows up at the Wolf's Lair with a briefcase with a bomb in it. And he puts it down right next to Hitler, and then excuses himself to go make a phone call. And while he's out of the room, some helpful German general thinks, aha, this briefcase might be in the Fuhrer's way, and he picked it up and moved it around behind a big, heavy wooden leg of the table. So the bomb went off. It actually killed 2 people in the room. But Hitler had his eardrum and his shoulder a little messed up, and he survived. When Stauffenberg is outside, he sees the explosion behind him. He thinks, aha, I've done it. He gets in his plane, flies back here to Berlin, expecting that his co-conspirators have taken over the radio station and the army headquarters on Benwaystrasse,